The range of views expressed in the British media about the Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians and Israel's bombardment of Gaza are pretty limited. The attacks were terrorism, and the bombardment by Israel is self-defense. But BBC Question Time has been held in Northern Ireland this week. That's a region with a very different history when it comes to occupation. And that meant one woman in the audience gave a view of events that we're not used to hearing on the BBC.
First of all, the ANC was a terrorist organisation and Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. And then you can say Yasser Arafat and the PLO, they were terrorists. Mr Heaton-Harris, this didn't start on the 7th of October. Do the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Because the speak is, Israel has a right to defend itself. Did Palestine have a right to defend itself when land was taken from it, when people were dispossessed, when houses were levelled, when UN resolutions on torture, on ethnic cleansing, on apartheid? Did the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Did they have a right to defend themselves when Israel turn on and turn off the electricity and stop food and stop medical aid long before this attack?
Well, let's let him answer, shall we?
Just one more thing, right? There are 600 Palestinian children buried under the rubble at this moment in time. There are over 500 Palestinian children dead, and there are 500 Palestinian children in jail, 150 of them minors. Hostages. The children under the rubble are hostages. The children in the jails are hostages. There are hostages on both sides here.
I think the most important thing she said there is this did not begin on the 7th of October, right? Because the thing that the mainstream media and the thing that the supporters of Israel really want us to think is that this came from nowhere. There's this difficult conflict, and then out of nowhere, one side committed this heinous act, and now Israel has to respond. And what that ignores is the fact that why this atrocity ever happened in the first place is because Israel has occupied a people either since 1948 or 1976, depending on your 1967, depending on your interpretation of the Israel-Palestine conflict. That's the background there. And then you have isolated the Palestinian Authority, ruled out any option of a sort of peaceful resolution of a two-state solution by continuing to expand settlements completely against international law. So the reason the Palestinian people have, no hope at the moment, and the reason why Hamas are very popular, right, is because the Israelis completely undermined the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis made it impossible to have any kind of solution, right? So the Palestinian people are desperate, and they're desperate because of Israeli actions. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. But obviously, the Israelis want you to think this just came out of nowhere. That's, by the way, also why they want everyone to call Hamas terrorists, because we have this frame of reference for terrorism, which is that it sort of comes out of nowhere, whereas this is a long-standing conflict where actually one side have committed more war crimes than the other, because the settlements, by the way, are against international law, and they've been doing them consistently, expanding, when everyone in the world recognizes that when you occupy a land, so it's as I say, there's disputes about whether the whole of Israel or the whole of Israel-Palestine is occupied territory, because people who are in favor of a two-state solution think that Israel proper is Israel, and then they're occupying the West Bank and Gaza. Now, everyone recognizes they're occupying, though, and it's one of the fundamental principles of international law that if you're occupying a place, well, one, you shouldn't do it for 56 years, and two, you are absolutely banned from introducing settlements there, because that is, that's annexation. That's just taking over someone else's land. Absolutely against international law. Israel have been doing it for decades. They've been breaking international law for decades. But we're supposed to forget about that and just say, oh, this act of terrorism came from nowhere. Another member of the audience took a different view. On the panel was Sinn Féin's John Finucane, who had this accusation levelled at him.
It came as no surprise to me whatsoever there that John Finucane deliberately dodged your question. He clearly supports a terrorist organisation in Hamas. Him and the rest of his cronies in the Sinn Féin are in bed with another terrorist organisation, be it the IRA. The two similarities...
Listen, I must that's a very serious allegation, and I must let John
everybody over
that.
here knows it. Sadly, through the week, Hamas bombed a hospital. Another similarity, that the IRA did exactly the same thing.
Hang on, are you talking about the Al-Ahli hospital? Mm-hmm. It is not clear who targeted
there's a high
that hospital
possibility that is true. The same things that IRA did here a number of years ago, bombed the Mater Hospital, the military wing, and killed 2 people. A disgrace. And that's the type of terrorist organisation him and his party are supporting.
John, of course I must let you answer that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's completely untrue, and I think it's what we're seeing is an opportunity to take the suffering of thousands and thousands of people in the Middle East to make what I would describe as a fairly cheap political point in what is a very serious conversation. You've made an accusation against me, and that's fine, you have a view, and I'm not going to patronise you to change it. But I'm somebody who grew up during a conflict. I'm somebody who had the conflict visited upon me, very personally, as a result of the murder of my father. The very first time that I voted in my life, I've said this before, was for the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm very grateful that I was given that opportunity by people on all sides who recognised the potential of dialogue, who recognised and created the conditions for peace that ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement that I was very proud to vote for the very first time that I voted. So I've benefited from peace. I've benefited from people who have not went out of their way to poke political opponents in their eye. And I'm reminded of the words of Martin McGuinness, who said that you don't make peace with your friends. And peace processes, by their very nature and definition, are difficult. They cause a lot of upset and difficult decisions to be made, but they are necessary for those who are serious about peace. So to clarify what I said in my earlier answer, is that there will be very difficult decisions that require to be taken by all sides in the Middle East at the minute, all sides who have both inflicted and suffered hurt. But it's not good enough, and I've sort of heard a little bit of mixed messaging from some of the answers so far tonight, that one, there's an absence of leadership in the Western world, but two, Israel has a right to defend itself. The way Israel is interpreting that, what is it? Because I think if we are to see leadership in the Western world, we are going to have to see the conditions for every armed group that is on the ground over there at the minute to be convinced and brought to the place where an immediate ceasefire is put in place, where all hostages are given back without a single second of delay, and the conditions are created where they can possibly aspire to what we have benefited from here.
That was a really interesting answer. I mean, I think we should be careful because at this point in time, the situation in Israel-Palestine looks so different to the situation in Northern Ireland when there was when the Good Friday Agreement came to pass. And for one, facts on the ground have sort of have made it very difficult for there to be a two-state solution. But I think the point raised there by the MP, by someone with experience of conflict, is to say, what the UK government is doing at the moment is precisely the opposite if you want any kind of remotely just peace. Right, because if you've got two groups of people who are competing, who sort of have these, their maximalist demands are completely incompatible with each other, you've got two outcomes by which the conflict ends. So one of them is one side achieves total domination and total victory. Now, that's what the Israelis want. Now, unfortunately, that would involve genocide and it would involve ethnic cleansing, right? So that's why that's unacceptable. The other thing it could involve is both sides having a similar amount of power, a similar amount of things to gain and lose, and then enough bargaining chips at the table to come to some compromise which is mutually agreeable. That's what happened in Northern Ireland, right? So you had the Unionists and the Republicans who it came to a point where they both had similar cards in their hands, and then they could come to the table and come to an agreement, which was it was neither's ideal position, but it worked for both of them. If that's what you wanted in Israel-Palestine, if you wanted something that looked like the Northern Ireland peace process and the Good Friday Agreement, what you should be doing with all the power you have is trying to increase the power of the Palestinians so that Israel has to make some compromises. Because at the moment, Israel has all the power, and so they're not willing to make any compromises. This is what happened in the Oslo Agreement, by the way, the Oslo Accords, the last time there was a peace process. They managed to come to some kind of starting point agreement, but it was completely undermined because Israel kept expanding its settlements. The reason it kept expanding its settlements is because it could, right? It chose land over peace. The problem was that the Palestinians didn't have enough power to enforce a compromise which would be mutually acceptable. So our government is doing precisely the opposite thing if what you want is peace. Unless you want peace via genocide, right? One way to end a conflict is to destroy one side. But if that's what you want, if that's your vision of peace, you are endorsing ethnic cleansing and you are endorsing genocide. So I hope that's not what our government is hoping for. And I think that should be the question put to our government. You arming Israel, you increasing the power of Israel, there's either two options that you're in favor of. Is it endless conflict because the Israelis are never going to be forced to compromise if that's what you keep doing, or is it genocide because it's one or the other? There is no way that you can be funding Israel, who already have all the power, and hope that that is going to lead to some kind of just peace. relatively just peace. Now, often peace accords involve some compromise, as they did in Northern Ireland. But there is no reason for the Israelis to compromise at the moment because everyone is funding them. They have all the cards. Helena, what did you think of that interaction there? It's very interesting that Question Time this week was in Northern Ireland, I think.
It was indeed, yeah. It was some interesting context given the history of the area. Now, to add further context as well, what the audience member was responding to is John Finucane's answer to the question asked to him by Fiona Bruce about whether he agreed with Israel's desire to get rid of Hamas. And he gave a pretty prevaricating answer that didn't really answer the question. And if you're in the position where you're a Sinn Féin representative, given their history, and you're not having a very specific answer to a question like this, that's very optically poor for you. And I'm really glad that he made a really good response to the actual audience member when he was brought up on this kind of stuff. Because you're absolutely right. This is all a result of material conditions. There's a moment from the debate between Piers Morgan and Hassan Piker last night where Hassan specifically says there's this view amongst kind of liberals, the kind of idealists in philosophical terms, who believe that obviously in idealist and materialism, there's two different competing ideas here rather than material conditions that would lead us to these positions in the first place, that lead to this kind of conflicts. Hassan meant the point that these people think that people are just do bad things because they're bad people and it springs up out of nowhere. As you mentioned before, it's the material conditions, it's the material material dialectic between Israel and Palestine that's led to the conflict. It's led to this disparity that will only continue this conflict unless those material conditions are alleviated. And so every single Hamas member could be removed. Every single member of the Al-Qassam brigades can end up being killed by Israel. And all of the buildings in Gaza could be flattened, or in Gaza City could be flattened as they moved out of the north now, for example. And I think it was Aaron Bastani was debating with Peter Hitchens on GB News last week. And he made this statement: every building flattened by Israel in Gaza is yet another Hamas recruit. It may not be by the name Hamas. It may not be the name of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, for example, or all of the other proscribed groups that are in that area. It will just be another group that it responds to the continual worsening of those material conditions. And you're right. Israel has all the cards. There's no reason for them to want to compromise in this position when they have the backing of the West, when they are, again, the most powerful military in the Middle East, and they get to act with continually impunity in every regard, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And it's telling. The kind of people who are in government now in Israel, people like Netanyahu, people like Likud, people like the other far-right groups that he essentially get to push him around in the Knesset because they know that they can collapse the government anytime if they want to. So they're pushing him to be as draconian, as aggressive as possible on settlement and on this desire. The foreign minister specifically said that they have the desire to annex parts of the Gaza. It has to be smaller after the end of this conflict. And these kind of people who are in power now were the kind of people who led to the ideology of the man who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin when he tried to have an actual material lasting peace. And so unless these ideologies that lead to these material conditions on either side of this conflict, as John Finucane said, are ameliorated and we actually come together to try and form a lasting peace like we did with the Good Friday Agreement, because I'm sure there are plenty of people during the Troubles who said, this is unresolvable. Both sides are too militaristic for there to ever to be a peace process. And here we are, 25-year anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and that has stood the test of time up until this point. So I think that there is room for compromise. There is room for these things to be solved diplomatically, but there has to be an agreement from the side with the power that they have to relinquish some of that to try and bring about a lasting peace. And that's going to be difficult, but it is possible.
And I think it has to be forced from the outside, right? Because if you've got all the power, then you're not going to compromise. I mean, your voters aren't going to vote for compromise if you've got all the power because, frankly, Israel don't need to compromise. They have the strongest military in the Middle East. The status quo for them, obviously, they've had a tragedy over the past couple of weeks. But I mean, with some better intelligence, they can probably stop happening again. And the whole point of Netanyahu was to say this status quo can continue, actually. We don't need to resolve this problem because we've got all the power.